Hello, good day. Thank you for taking your time to attend our presentation titled Language Barriers in Medical Consultation, Observations from a Urology Clinic in Singapore. Before starting today's presentation, let me quickly read a passage from a volume by Diamond and Jacobs. The nature and complexity of language barriers in healthcare vary within and across nations, owing to the culture and political nature of the nation, and/or the culture and political nature of the linguistic groups residing in and seeking healthcare in those countries. With this diversity of contexts comes a need for diverse approaches to overcoming language barriers in healthcare. Diamond and Jacobs identified the needs for a diverse approach that takes account on the complexity of each healthcare context. The current paper contributes to this issue by reporting our observation from Singapore context. It will show, in the lack of a formal system of language selection, a hidden, fully operational and organic system is present. The data is 150 recordings of authentic medical consultation in a specialist clinic in a public hospital in Singapore. Here we have a schematic diagram of the observed hidden language selection system. We observed that medical consultations now data are regularly initiated by a brief language negotiation sequence where the language of the rest of the consultation gets to be decided. If the specialist and the patient have a language in common, then the consultation will be done in that language. If not, then there are several possibilities. If the patient is accompanied, and the companion has a language in common with the specialist and the patient, then the companion will act as an interpreter. If the companion does not have a language in common with the specialist and the patient, therefore unable to interpret, or for some reason unable to interpret, then the case will be treated similar to an accompanied patient. If the patient is unaccompanied, then an ad hoc interpreter will be sought. If the patient shares a common language with the patient service associate or PSA of the current consultation room, then the PSA will act as the interpreter. If not, then the room's PSA will try to look for and summon another on-duty PSA within the same outpatient clinic who has a common language with the patient. Alright, how do you observe and then identify this hidden system? Before getting into our method, data and observations, let me share some context for us to understand the data. The first one is multilingualism in Singapore. For those who are not familiar with the Singapore linguistic landscape, let me give a quick overview. Most of Singapore's population are multilingual, at least bilingual. Education are done in English, including medical education. Singapore has 4 official languages. They are English, Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. The actual language spoken in Singapore should be more than those 4 languages. As we observe in our data, patients also speak Hokkien, Teochew, Hainanese, and Cantonese. There may still be some other languages that were not captured in our data. Now our data. Our data is 150 recordings of naturally occurring or authentic medical consultation, recorded for almost a year in 2007 from a urology clinic of one public hospital in Singapore. So the consultation is between a specialist, urologist, and the patient. Naturally occurring or authentic means that there was no intervention to the natural flow of medical consultation. We simply put a camera in the consultation room and recorded the consultation. In terms of language, 81 of the consultations now data are done in English, while the rest are done either entirely in Mandarin Chinese or a mix of English, Mandarin Chinese, and other languages. The current paper employed conversation analysis or CA as its method. The data are transcribed according to Gale-Jefferson transcription symbol. The detailed transcription gives us handles in making detailed moment-by-moment observation of the data. The tradition of using CA to analyze talk in institutional setting goes a very long way, as long as the birth of this method in the 60s. One of the earliest observations made by Harvey Sachs, one of the CA initiators, is on call openings to a suicide prevention hotlines in Los Angeles, USA. He observed that if callers do not give their names at a specific junctures, which is right after the answerer introduced themselves at the call opening, then getting the caller's name will be an issue. Here we have an extract transcript of such interaction where the caller did not voluntarily produce his name right after the answerer produced his name at the call opening. And it turned out that the caller resisted giving his name later on. Sachs' observation is derived from rigorous observation on each of the call opening of this data. The current observation is derived through the same rigor and analytic mindset. Now let's look at what we observe in our data. A prominent feature of consultation opening is the presence of what we call as language negotiation sequence. The specialists in our data regularly produce an utterance such as English or at the consultation opening. It regularly occurs as soon as the patient enters the consultation room, even before the patient sits down. In the context of multilingual speakers in societies such as Singapore, this practice seems to be rather instinctive. When people are generally multilingual or at least bilingual, before starting to do any activity, one thing that has to be settled should be which one out of the linguistic repertoires that the participant have, which one is going to be used. However, interesting enough, my search on literature or report on language negotiation medical consultation opening in Singapore did not result in any hit. I do hope by presenting our observation in this conference, I may get some leads. Now let's look at the language negotiation sequence closer, especially on figuring out and then selecting a common language. Out of 150 recordings, 90 of them contain specialists producing explicit language negotiation. Explicit language negotiation in our data generally takes two forms. The first one is checking whether a certain language is okay for the consultation, and the second one is giving option. In case 005 here, we have the specialist say, would it be better to speak in Mandarin, a few seconds into the consultation. In case 063 here, we have the specialist says, hi, English or, as the first utterance that he produces in the entire consultation. Then for the rest of the 60 consultations, 8 recordings only start some moments after the consultation opening, so we do not know whether the specialist produced explicit language negotiation at its opening. Then in other 8 of the recordings, the patient starts to talk to the specialist in a language. This seems to be an efficient procedure for language selection. It cuts short the need for specialist-initiated language negotiation. For example, here we have case 106, where the moment the patient enters the room, the patient greets the specialist in English. The picture here is the moment when the patient enters the room and speaks to the doctor in English, or greet the doctors in English. The doctor turns his head to the right at the patient and the door. In the picture, we cannot see the patient because the PSA, the patient service associate, stands between the camera and the patient because she just opened the door for the patient. Then out of 150 recordings, we have 44 recorded consultation where language negotiation is non-observable. Some contextualized cue for language determination or language selection in those consultations may be present. We also have some leads in the data pointing out the possibility of membership categorization at work, which potentially explains the speed of language selection in the absence of explicit language negotiation sequence, pending further detailed observations. Language negotiation sequence is critical because the language of the current consultation gets to be determined at that point. What happens when the specialist and patient do not have shared language? If the patient is accompanied and the companion has a language in common with the specialist and the patient, then the company or the patient companion, will act as an interpreter. Here we have case 099 where the patient cannot speak English, but the companion, in this case, the son, can speak English. Here the specialist asks whether the patient speaks English. The question is then replied by firstly the son, then the daughter-in-law, and then the patient twice. In this case, the son and daughter-in-law can speak English, so the consultations are done in English. We have 7 of such cases with differing degree of patient's involvement. Case 099 is notable since the patient is one of the least involved, even without observable cognitive or hearing issue. So let's stay with this case for a while. Here on the screen we have an anonymized still taken at the treatment recommendation stage, which is almost at the end of the consultation. Here the specialist explains the treatment plan for the patient. The patient comes to the consultation for incontinence. Here the doctor explains about sphincter's muscle exercise that the patient has to do to address her incontinence. Amid the doctor's explanation, the patient asks when she can go home in Malay. Then this hand gesture is the response that she gets from her daughter-in-law, while the daughter-in-law said yes later. We can also see how the specialist and the son are engaged in a serious discussion. The situation shows the patient detachment from the agenda of the consultation. Then also the family member or interpreter, in this case, absence of effort to include the patient into her own medical consultation. Undoubtedly, other dynamics play roles here, as what has been well documented in consultations involving family members, the ones on the screen just to name a few. In this case in case 099, it's quite notable since the patient cannot speak English. There's an extra layer of barriers for her to access her own consultation. She cannot even participate as a passive listener due to the language barrier. Therefore, there's this complete detachment of her from the agenda of her own medical consultation. Now let's continue with the consultations where the patients come alone or the companion does not take the role of interpreter. We have 3 of such cases in our data. In all 3, PSAs were recruited as an ad hoc interpreters. PSA is Patient Service Associate. They are hospital staffs that assist the specialist and liaise with the patient in the consultation room. Here in this case 088, the patient recruits the PSA. In line 6, we see that the specialist initiates the consultation by offering the patient to use English. In response, the patient shakes his head and then points at the PSA while saying Chinese la, suggesting that he prefers Chinese and interprets by the PSA. In response, the doctor turns his head towards the PSA while saying, just help me translate. And then the consultation is done in English while being interpreted by the PSA in Chinese. Here is another case 077. Here the patient comes with a family member, but for some reason the family member does not take the role of interpreter. Here, as soon as the family member and the patient enters the room, the specialist asks whether the family member speaks English. At the same time, the family member asks the specialist whether she speaks Malay. The specialist then says she cannot speak Malay. Then they come into conclusion that they need to get PSA from a different consultation room in the clinic, since the participant is speaking Teochew or Hokkien, while neither the specialist nor the PSA of the current consultation room is speaking that language. Getting PSA from another consultation room within the same specialist clinic seems quite an efficient practice. As we see here, it took less than a minute to get the person, then start the consultation. Noting that the consultation 077 here takes only around 6 minutes, including the time needed for getting the PSA from the other room. In the 3 cases where PSAs perform ad hoc interpreters, we can see some successes of interpreting to a different degree. The PSAs are not trained medical interpreter. It is expected that the performance would be inconsistent across various PSA or interpreter, as what have been reported in various literature. The ones on the screen, just to name a few. For example, for this case, we have case 088. We can see how the PSA and patient spend some time clearing up the confusion between left and right in Mandarin. The PSA then admits issue with her mastery in Mandarin as she confused left or right. She even said that I can't speak Mandarin. The confusion becomes quite critical since it concerns about a nodule on the patient's prostate that may be cancerous. They, the patient and the specialist, do not get to discuss what it means to have nodule on the prostate and instead spend a considerable amount of clearing the left and right confusion. Noting that this consultation takes only 7 minutes, while this episode of left and right confusion took around 40 seconds. In this case, the specialist, the only other person in the consultation room, has no access to assist, correct, or assess the interpretation quality due to language barrier. The positive side of the above system is that at least what suggested by our pool of 150 consultations from a single clinic, that none of the patient was turned down by any specialist simply because of language. The consultation still can take place, though without shared language between the specialist and patient. And language selection happens quite efficiently. The only case when the PSA from other room is called upon only took 40 seconds, while the average length of consultation in our data is 8 to 9 minutes. However, how the medical consultations are done as a result of what happened during the language selection stage varies from one consultation to another. So far as our data suggest, how the language selection affects the healthcare outcome is undetected. From the lack of report and literature on the situation in Singapore, it is doubtful that the stakeholders are aware of the extent of even the presence of this hidden language selection system. To sum up, multilingualism does affect and shape how medical consultations are done in our research site in Singapore. A system has been in place to select the consultation's language, at least in our data site. The positive side of this system is that any patients coming to the consultation room can receive medical consultation, and the language selection is observably quite efficient. However, there are also unwanted consequences. There are potential interpreting issues related to the engagement of non-trained medical interpreter, extra barriers to non-English patients who come with family members, and there is no system in place to evaluate the quality of the interpretation. As language and medical communication researcher, I think there's a duty to formalize, document, and make this issue known, so that future research in the field of healthcare delivery includes this issue into their research agenda. Further research is needed to explore the extent of this hidden language selection system, firstly investigating the presence and saliency of the system in other clinical settings and other clinics, and then investigate its effect on to the rest of the medical consultation and patient healthcare outcome. So here's the selected reference.